Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. He was told there was a report, not just any report, a report that justified everything that came after. He was told that based on that report, certain decisions had already been made. Decisions about access, decisions about contact, decisions about what he was allowed to do and what he wasn't. And the way it was explained to him, it wasn't presented as a question. It was presented as fact. There is a report. This is what it says, and this is what it means for you. So he did something simple. He asked for it, not emotionally, not aggressively, just directly. He asked for a copy of the report that was being used to justify everything that had already happened. He asked for the report number. He asked for the originating agency. He asked for any documentation that supported what he had been told. Because if something is real, there should be a record of it. That's how this works. If a report exists, it can be identified, it can be located, it can be produced. So he put the request in writing. He asked for everything connected to it, any report indicating he had been trespassed, any documentation restricting contact with his daughter, any record showing the basis for what he had been told. And then he waited. Because at that point, this isn't a debate anymore. It's just a question of documentation. Either it exists or it doesn't. And when the response came back, it didn't contain the report. It didn't contain a report number. It didn't contain an originating agency. It didn't contain any documentation supporting what he had been told. The response was simple. There were no responsive records, no documentation confirming a trespass, no documentation confirming a restriction on contact, no documentation confirming the basis of what had already been communicated to him, as if it were established fact. So now there's a situation. Because something was said and something was acted on, but the thing that was supposed to support it wasn't there. And that changes the question, because now the question isn't, what does the report say? Now the question is, what report were they talking about? And that wasn't the only document that didn't exist. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. He was told not to contact his daughter. It wasn't presented as a suggestion. It wasn't framed as a conversation. It was communicated as something that was already decided, something that carried weight, something that sounded like it was backed by authority. So he did what you're supposed to do when something like that happens. He asked for the documentation. He asked for the order. He asked for the record. He asked for anything that showed where that instruction came from. Because if you're being told not to contact your own child, you would expect that to exist somewhere in writing. You would expect there to be an order, a directive, something enforceable, something you can point to. But when he asked for it, nothing was provided. No court order, no written directive, no documentation identifying the agency that issued it, no record that explained the basis for the instruction. And that creates another problem, because the instruction didn't disappear. It didn't get withdrawn. It continued to be treated as if it was valid, as if it was real, as if it had already been established. But when he asked for the source of it, there was nothing to produce. So now there are two things happening at the same time. An instruction that carries authority and no documentation that supports it. And that raises a question. Where did it come from? Because whatever that answer is, it connects back to something else. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. A report was created. It was classified under something serious, something that immediately changes how a situation is viewed. It was labeled as neglect. That's how it was recorded. That's how it was categorized. And once something is labeled that way, it carries weight. It affects how people respond. It affects how decisions are made. It affects how everything that comes after it is interpreted. But then something else happened. The report was marked as completed, not pending, not ongoing, completed. And not only was it completed, prosecution was declined. That's what the record shows. No charges, no follow-through, no continuation of the case in that direction. So now you have a report that starts one way and ends another. It begins with a classification that carries serious implications and ends with no prosecution. But here's where it gets complicated. Because even though the case reached that outcome, the existence of the report didn't just disappear. The classification didn't just get ignored, it continued to exist in the background. It continued to be referenced, directly or indirectly, in ways that still influenced what was happening. So now there are two parts to the same document, the beginning and the ending. One suggests something serious happened. The other shows that nothing moved forward, and both of those things exist at the same time. Which leads to a question. If the outcome was already determined, why did the classification still matter? Because that's when another version of the story starts to show up. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. At first, there was only one report, one version of what happened, one classification, one official record that everything seemed to point back to. And when you're dealing with something like that, you assume that's the version that matters, because that's how it works. Something happens, it gets documented, and that document becomes the reference point for everything that follows. But then something else shows up, a second report, different agency, different classification, same situation. Now on its own, that doesn't seem unusual. Different departments document things differently. Different officers categorize things differently. That happens. But when you actually look at both of them, side by side, they don't just look different, they feel different. The first report is structured a certain way. It uses specific language. It assigns a classification that carries a certain kind of weight. And then you look at the second one, and the classification changes. The framing changes. The way the situation is categorized changes. It's no longer just a matter of how something was recorded. It's a matter of what that record means. Because classifications matter. They're not just labels. They determine how something is interpreted. They influence how people respond. They affect what happens next. So when you have two reports documenting the same situation, but assigning different meanings to it, you don't just have two documents. You have two interpretations, and both of them exist in the same system. Both of them are official. Both of them can be referenced. Both of them can be used. And that's where things start to shift. Because once there are two versions, the question isn't just what happened anymore. It's which version is being relied on. And when? Because depending on which one is being used, the outcome changes. The way someone is viewed changes. The way decisions are made changes. And you don't always get told which version is being used. You just see the result. You just feel the impact of whatever interpretation is being applied in that moment. So now there's a situation that exists in two forms, one that started the process and one that entered later, but didn't match the first. And once that happens, the story isn't just being recorded anymore, it's being shaped. And when something starts being shaped, it doesn't stop there, because that's when it starts showing up somewhere else, in a different format, with a different purpose. And that's when the narrative begins to take on a life of its own. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. At some point, everything changes. Up until then, it's reports, it's documentation, it's records being created in real time. But eventually, it moves into a different space, court filings. And that's where things start to feel different. Because reports document what happened, filings present what something means. They take everything that came before and organize it into a narrative. A version of events that's meant to be understood a certain way. And once something is written like that, it carries weight. Because now it's not just a record, it's a position, it's an argument. It's a structured explanation of why something should be viewed a certain way and why certain actions should follow. So when those filings are created, you start seeing language that goes beyond simple documentation. Descriptions of behavior, characterizations of patterns, statements about risk, statements about concern, and all of it is written in a way that connects the dots. Even if those dots came from different places, even if they came from different reports, with different classifications, with different outcomes, because once it's in a filing, it's all presented together as one cohesive picture. And that's where the difference begins, Because when you go back and you look at the original documents, they don't always tell the story the same way. They don't always use the same language. They don't always reach the same conclusions. Some of them document a single event. Some of them document an interaction. Some of them end without further action. But when everything is brought into a filing, it's no longer separate pieces. It's one narrative. And that narrative becomes the foundation for what happens next. Because once something is presented that way, decisions are made based on it. Actions are taken based on it, and those actions don't just exist on paper. They affect real access, real communication, real outcomes. So now there are two layers to the same situation: what was documented at the time and what was later said about it. And those two layers don't always match perfectly. And when they don't, the difference between them starts to matter, because that difference doesn't stay theoretical. It turns into something real, something that changes what happens next. And once that happens, the process moves forward, not based on a single document, but based on how all of them were put together. And that's when decisions begin to take shape.